The sky above the northern reaches of Europe no longer felt empty. It had weight now, a pressure that seemed to bend the clouds and compress the air itself. Long before the bombers were visible, their presence was sensed as a distant vibration, a low, persistent tremor that traveled through the upper atmosphere and down into the bones of those watching radar screens hundreds of kilometers away. The night was thick with cloud, layered and restless, illuminated only by the faint silver glow of the moon struggling to break through. Then, one by one, shapes emerged from the darkness, massive, deliberate, unmistakable. The Russian strategic bombers moved with an almost ceremonial calm. Their swept wings cut through the cloud cover as if it were water, navigation lights blinking in measured intervals, red and white pulses marking their slow advance. Tu-95s, with their counter-rotating propellers, looked archaic at first glance, relics from another era, yet there was nothing outdated about the payloads they carried or the message they were designed to send. Alongside them flew the sleeker Tu-160s, their white fuselages briefly catching moonlight before slipping back into shadow. Together, they formed a silent procession, a reminder that history had not ended, only changed its costumes. Inside the bombers, crews sat strapped into their seats, surrounded by softly glowing instruments and the constant hum of machinery. The cockpit lights were dim, red-tinted to preserve night vision, casting sharp shadows across tired faces. These men were not shouting or celebrating. They were professionals executing a mission that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Checklists were followed, coordinates confirmed, communications kept minimal. Every movement was deliberate, every action restrained, because restraint itself was part of the signal. This was not an attack. It was something more unsettling, a demonstration of readiness. Below them, the clouds rolled endlessly, hiding the borders they were approaching. Somewhere beneath that blanket of grey lay cities full of sleeping civilians, highways lit by strings of headlights, and military bases that were very much awake. Radar installations across NATO countries tracked the incoming formations, their operators leaning closer to their screens as symbols updated in real time. Each blip represented a bomber carrying weapons powerful enough to reshape continents, yet the screen showed them maintaining careful distances, flying routes that skirted the edges of sovereign airspace without crossing the invisible lines that would turn tension into open conflict. The atmosphere in those command centers was thick with unspoken thoughts. Coffee cups went untouched. Conversations dropped to whispers. Officers exchanged looks that carried more meaning than words. They had trained for this, simulated it countless times, but training never quite captured the reality of watching such aircraft move so close to home. The bombers' flight paths were analyzed again and again, projected forward in time, compared against known patterns from previous patrols. This one was different. Larger. More coordinated. Impossible to ignore. High above the bombers, satellites glided silently along their orbits, their sensors fixed on the formations below. Data streamed down to ground stations across the world, feeding analysts and decision-makers who understood exactly how these images would be interpreted. The bombers were not hiding. On the contrary, they wanted to be seen. Their transponders were active, their routes predictable. It was theater on a global stage, a performance designed to remind everyone watching that certain capabilities still existed, still mattered, and could be brought to bear at a moment's notice. As the formation continued its patrol, the weather worsened. Winds at altitude pushed against the aircraft, causing subtle shifts in formation that were quickly corrected. The clouds thickened, turning the sky into a churning sea of grey and black. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the bombers in stark, almost surreal detail. For a split second, the sheer scale of the machines was visible, the length of their wings, the bulk of their fuselages, the weapons bays hidden within. Then the darkness closed in again, swallowing them whole. On the ground, fighter jets sat on runways with engines warmed and pilots on standby. Air defense systems tracked, calculated, waited. The rules were clear: no provocation, no unnecessary escalation. Yet everyone understood how thin that line could be. A misinterpreted maneuver, a technical malfunction, a moment of human error, any of it could change the course of history. That awareness hung over the night like the clouds themselves, heavy and inescapable. Inside one of the Tu-160s, a navigator glanced at his display, then out through the cockpit window. There was nothing to see but darkness and cloud, yet he knew exactly where they were. Years of training had taught him to visualize invisible borders, to feel the proximity of other nations without ever seeing them. He thought briefly of home, of the ordinary life that felt impossibly distant at this altitude, and then pushed the thought aside. Personal reflections had no place here. The mission came first. As the bombers reached the apex of their patrol route, they began a slow, coordinated turn. It was graceful in its own way, a massive ballet performed by machines weighing hundreds of tons. One by one, they adjusted course, their formation tightening as they prepared to head back toward Russian airspace. The message had been delivered. There was no need to linger. Prolonging the patrol would only invite miscalculation, and the point had never been to provoke an immediate response. Still, the echo of their presence lingered. Radar operators continued to track them as they receded, watching the symbols slowly drift away from the borders. Commanders began drafting reports, choosing their words carefully, knowing that every sentence would be dissected by politicians and allies alike. Analysts compared this patrol to past ones, noting the differences, debating what it signaled about future intentions. Was it a warning? A test? A response to something unseen by the public? The answers were not clear, and uncertainty itself was part of the impact. Back in the sky, the bombers disappeared once more into cloud and darkness, leaving behind only contrails that quickly dissipated in the turbulent air. The vibration that had announced their arrival faded, replaced by the usual sounds of the night. Yet nothing felt quite the same. The world below had been reminded of how fragile its calm really was, how easily the balance could shift. When morning came, headlines would speak of bombers circling borders and tensions rising, but those words would fail to capture the feeling of that night, the weight of the sky, the quiet professionalism of the crews, the collective breath held by nations watching from afar. For now, the bombers flew on toward home, engines steady, lights blinking, carrying with them the unspoken understanding that this was only one chapter in a much longer, more uncertain story. The command center never truly slept, but on this night it felt as if every circuit, every human nerve inside it had been jolted awake at once. Rows of screens filled the underground hall, their cold blue and green light reflecting off steel walls and the faces of the officers gathered before them. Maps of Europe dominated the largest displays, layered with symbols that shifted and pulsed in real time. Aircraft icons crept along the edges of NATO airspace, their trajectories traced by thin digital lines that seemed almost fragile given what they represented. The hum of servers and ventilation systems blended with the low murmur of voices, creating a constant background noise that pressed in from all sides. Radar operators leaned forward in their chairs, eyes fixed on the data streaming past faster than it could be consciously processed. Numbers updated by the second, altitude, speed, heading, each change scrutinized for meaning. A slight deviation could be routine turbulence or a deliberate maneuver. No one assumed anything. Every possibility was considered, logged, cross-checked. Coffee sat cooling in paper cups, forgotten as adrenaline replaced fatigue. Hands moved almost automatically across keyboards and touchscreens, muscle memory taking over as training asserted itself. Across the room, senior officers stood around a central table where a three-dimensional tactical map hovered in holographic projection. NATO member states glowed in cool blues, while the surrounding regions were shaded in neutral grays. Red markers indicated potential threats, their color deliberately chosen to draw the eye and quicken the pulse. As new information arrived, aides stepped forward to whisper updates, passing tablets back and forth like critical documents in an old war film, except now everything was digital, instantaneous, and unforgiving. Above ground, the alert had already rippled outward. Air bases across Europe came alive as klaxons sounded and floodlights snapped on, bathing runways in harsh white light. Mechanics moved quickly but methodically, their breath visible in the cold air as they performed final checks on fighter jets lined up like coiled predators. Pilots arrived in silence, their faces set, helmets tucked under their arms. There was no bravado, no dramatic speeches, just nods, brief exchanges, and a shared understanding of the gravity of the moment. Inside one cockpit, a pilot strapped in and began running through pre-flight procedures, her voice calm as she confirmed each step over the radio. The canopy reflected the lights of the base, turning the world outside into a fractured mosaic. Somewhere far away, bombers were circling borders, but here and now the focus was narrower. Engines, instruments, fuel, weapon systems. The jet vibrated as power flowed through it, a restrained force waiting for permission to be unleashed. Back in the command center, communication lines buzzed constantly. Secure channels connected capitals across the alliance: Washington, Brussels, Berlin, Warsaw, London, each node feeding into the same web of information. Political leaders were briefed in real time, their reactions filtered back down as guidance and constraints. Escalation had to be managed as carefully as defense. The goal was deterrence, not panic, strength without recklessness. Every order was weighed against its potential consequences, both immediate and long-term. An intelligence analyst pulled up historical data, overlaying current flight paths with those from previous patrols. Patterns emerged, but so did anomalies. The formation was larger this time, more coordinated, timed to coincide with diplomatic tensions that had been simmering for weeks. The analyst highlighted key differences and sent the report up the chain, knowing it would be debated, challenged, refined. In this environment, certainty was rare, and doubt could be dangerous. Outside, the night sky over Europe felt unusually crowded. Surveillance aircraft orbited at high altitude, their sensors sweeping vast areas of airspace. Drones moved silently along predetermined routes, feeding imagery back to operators who watched from rooms thousands of kilometers away. Naval vessels adjusted their positions in nearby seas, radar arrays rotating steadily as they tracked not just aircraft but each other, ensuring that no unexpected movement went unnoticed. The alliance was a machine in motion, gears turning smoothly despite the tension that drove them. In one Eastern European capital, a small group of officers gathered in a national command room, its design more modest but no less intense. For countries closest to the perceived threat, the stakes felt deeply personal. Borders were not abstract lines on a screen but real places, forests, rivers, towns, where families lived and history weighed heavily. The officers spoke in their native language, voices low, expressions grim, as they coordinated closely with NATO headquarters, grateful for the reassurance of collective defense even as they felt the vulnerability of geography. As the hours passed, fatigue began to creep in, but no one allowed it to slow them down. Shifts rotated seamlessly, fresh eyes replacing tired ones without breaking the flow of information. Medical staff stood by quietly, ready to intervene if stress or exhaustion took a toll. Psychologists had long warned that modern warfare tested minds as much as machines, and this night was a textbook example. No shots fired, no explosions, yet nerves stretched taut across an entire continent. On one screen, a NATO fighter formation lifted off, its icons accelerating rapidly as they climbed to intercept altitude. The room grew even quieter as everyone watched. This was routine, a precautionary measure, but routine actions carried extraordinary weight when framed by global politics. The fighters maintained a respectful distance from the bombers they shadowed, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid provocation. Cameras captured images that would later circulate among analysts and, selectively, the public, proof that vigilance had been maintained. Messages flowed to and from diplomatic channels as well. Ambassadors reached out, statements were drafted, carefully worded to reassure domestic audiences while signaling resolve to adversaries. Language mattered. A single phrase could be interpreted as weakness or aggression. Teams of experts debated synonyms and punctuation with the same intensity that pilots monitored fuel levels. In this crisis, words were weapons too. As dawn approached, the immediate tension began to ease slightly. The bombers turned back, fighter escorts adjusted course, and alert levels were reviewed but not lowered. No one declared victory or relief. Instead, there was a sober recognition that this night would not be an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, a reminder that the strategic environment had shifted and that vigilance would be the new normal. When sunlight finally filtered down to the surface, casting pale light over runways and city streets, the command center remained active. Reports were compiled, lessons noted, readiness assessed. Outside, most civilians went about their mornings unaware of how close the world had come to a more dramatic turn. Inside the halls of power and defense, however, the memory of glowing screens and silent aircraft would linger. NATO had stood watch through the night, its unity tested not by open war but by the slow, grinding pressure of a world once again defined by lines, borders, and the constant hum of readiness.